Maybe your past didn't ruin you. Maybe it was the version of it you told yourself. Every night before sleep, every morning you woke up already tired. Every time someone asked if you were okay and you smiled like you weren't holding 1,000 scenes in your throat. There's a fracture most people never notice, a split between what happened and the story you constructed to survive it. That quiet moment when something cracked, and instead of falling, you started editing. You stitched together explanations, justifications, rationalizations, not because they were true, but because they made the pain make sense. That's what the mind does when the soul can't breathe. It writes fiction and calls it memory. Carl Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." But what if we never actually chose? What if we just adopted the version that hurt the least, or the one that made us feel less guilty, or the one that justified our silence? You didn't build your life. You built a script to avoid reliving certain scenes, to make sure that what broke you once wouldn't break you again. But that script became a cage, and now you rehearse the same lines over and over. I'm not good enough, they never cared. I always ruin everything. Maybe I'm just broken. But here's the silent heresy. What if the story that haunts you isn't even true anymore? What if it never was? Not because the pain wasn't real, but because the story you wrapped around it is still dragging a past into a present that's begging to breathe. Viktor Frankl wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." But when your story is running the show, there is no space. Just reaction, just repetition, just the familiar comfort of self-doubt disguised as truth. So let's begin here, not by rewriting your life, but by quietly asking, what if the version of your story that hurts the most was never the whole truth? What if you stopped being the actor and started listening to the one who never got to speak? That is where the real life begins. You don't just remember the past, you rehearse it. You relive it through language, through inner monologues, through the things you repeat to yourself in the quiet hours of collapse. I'm broken. They never cared. I always ruin everything. It doesn't matter if the people are gone, if the scene is over, if the wounds have already scarred. What matters is that the voice survived, and it's still narrating your life as if it's stuck in Act 1. You didn't choose this narrative because it's true. You chose it because it fit the pain. Over time, the story becomes an identity, not because it's accurate, but because it's consistent. Cognitive narrative identity theory says that we are the stories we tell ourselves, but that's only half the truth. The other half is darker. We become trapped in those stories, even when they no longer serve us, especially when they make us feel like we belong to our suffering. Because repetition is addictive, even when it hurts, even when it freezes you, especially then. There's a strange safety in emotional fiction, in telling yourself again and again that you are this wounded version of yourself, that you're unlovable, that nothing ever works, that life only gives you echoes of disappointment. It hurts, but at least it's familiar, and the familiar feels like home, even when it's a prison. You are not stuck in your life, you are stuck in your narration of it. That's the cage, not the facts, not the events. But the story you keep feeding, the one that tells you who you are, even when your soul knows better. And here's the tragedy. When your story is the same for too long, you start believing that change would be a betrayal of yourself. You cling to the pain because it's the last thing that feels real. But what if there's more than one version? What if who you are is the one who can see the story, not just play it? There's power in that space. Not the kind that shouts. The kind that pauses, listens, and begins to whisper, "This script isn't mine anymore." There's a moment no one remembers, but everyone carries. The first time you stopped being yourself and started performing the version that wouldn't get hurt. Trauma isn't always loud. Sometimes it enters silently, like a ghost rewriting the lines of your life from behind the scenes. Suddenly, you're no longer acting from choice. You're reacting from survival. Every decision becomes a defense. Every silence becomes armor. And the worst part is, you start calling it personality. You say, I don't trust people. But what you mean is, once someone broke something inside me that I never rebuilt. You say, I don't need anyone. But what you mean is, I stopped needing because needing became dangerous. You say, I'm just like this. But maybe you're not. Maybe you're just reading from a script that fear wrote years ago, and you never stopped performing it. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the parts of us we hide, repress, deny. But the shadow isn't just a buried wound, it's a ghostwriter. It scripts your reactions, your relationships, your silences. It makes you choose the wrong people, because that's the only kind of love you rehearsed. You keep auditioning for roles you hate, because they're the only ones your wounds ever offered you. And the performance becomes so convincing, you forget it is a performance. You're not cold. You're just afraid to need warmth again. You're not careless. You're just tired of caring for people who never cared back. You're not broken. You just built a character to survive and got lost inside the mask. But here's the truth beneath the ashes. The pain didn't stay in the past. It became the narrator. And until you take back the pen, it will keep rewriting you into stories that feel like safety, but taste like slow death. You're not meant to stay loyal to the first version of yourself that had to survive. You're allowed to become someone new, not because you're erasing the pain, but because you finally stopped letting it write your life. There's a strange warmth in feeling wronged. It justifies the ache. It explains the silence. It gives meaning to the fragments that never found a place to belong. To be the one who was hurt, it offers a certain power, not loud, not triumphant, but quietly untouchable. You wear it like armor. They did this to me. It wasn't my fault. I'm like this because they broke something. And for a while it saves you. It protects you from the unbearable weight of guilt, from the terrifying possibility that you might have to begin again on your own. It becomes your shield and your story. But there's a cost, because victimhood doesn't just explain the past. It starts to shape the future. You become the person who needs to be wronged to feel real. You seek out echoes of old pain, not because you want to suffer, but because suffering became familiar. And the familiar feels like truth. The heartbreak, it's not just theirs, it's yours again. The betrayal, not new, just a variation of the original script. And without noticing, you start building a life that repeats the wound, just to keep the narrative consistent. Existential psychology calls this the dilemma of responsibility. Because the moment you stop being the victim is the moment you realize you've been participating in your own stagnation. That hurts more than any betrayal, because now the question isn't, why did they do this to me? It becomes, why did I keep living like it was still happening? Victimhood is seductive. It wraps your pain in meaning. But over time, it requires one thing, that you always remain the one without power. And slowly, it deadens you. You wear your pain like armor, and then wonder why you can't feel anything anymore. But what if you don't need to be right about the hurt anymore? What if healing begins the moment you stop needing your pain to be your identity? There's a quiet liberation in letting go of the story that justified everything, and daring to ask, who am I? Without my wound as my name. Memory lies. Not because it wants to deceive you, but because it wants to protect the version of you that feels safest. You don't remember everything that happened. You remember what fits the story you've been telling yourself about who you are. If you believe you're unlovable, your mind filters your past to highlight every rejection. If you see yourself as a failure, you forget the quiet victories and magnify every fall. If your identity depends on being the abandoned one, you'll even reinterpret kindness as temporary, conditional, fake. It's not dishonesty, it's survival. Your mind becomes the editor, trimming the scenes, darkening the light, muting the words that don't match the script, because consistency feels safer than truth. Psychologists call it confirmation bias. But underneath that theory is something deeper, something more human. You needed to become someone who made sense of the chaos. And once that version crystallized, the anxious one, the strong one, the broken one, everything else got filtered through that lens. Your memory isn't a documentary, it's a film, directed by fear, scripted by shame, edited by a version of you that thought survival meant reducing yourself to one story. And when you cling to that identity, reality stops being what's happening. It becomes what fits. Even if it's a lie, you're not lying to others. You're living in the lie you made for yourself to survive. But here's the quiet terror. The more you protect that identity, the more truth becomes dangerous. You begin to fear joy because it threatens the sad character you've grown attached to. You begin to fear love because it contradicts the belief that no one stays. You begin to fear growth because it would mean your story was incomplete. And if your story was incomplete, then maybe you've been punishing yourself for a version of events that never existed. But what if you allowed the memory to breathe again? What if you stopped editing out the parts where you mattered? There's nothing more courageous than this. To look at your own mind and whisper, maybe I was wrong about myself. Some voices in your head were never yours to begin with. They just got passed down, whispered, repeated, until you mistook them for your own thoughts. You grew up in someone else's silence, in their fears, their failures, their unhealed wounds. And somewhere along the way, you inherited more than their genes. You inherited their unfinished stories. Maybe the sadness you carry doesn't belong to your life alone, but to the generations before you who never had the language to grieve. Maybe the fear that keeps you small was never born in you, but in a parent who taught you to flinch before you even knew what danger was. You didn't choose the first story. It was handed to you, folded into gestures, expectations, punishments, praises. Be good, be quiet, be strong, be useful, be invisible. So you learned the script and you performed, until the mask hardened into skin and the echo of others became the sound of your own voice. Montaigne wrote, "We are, I know not how, double in ourselves, so that what we believe we disbelieve and cannot rid ourselves of what we condemn." That's the paradox. You sense something's off, you feel the dissonance, but it's hard to rebel against a story you've never questioned, because questioning means loss. It means stepping outside the roles that made you feel safe. It means realizing that some of your deepest beliefs aren't true, weren't chosen, were just absorbed, and that realization breaks something. But in the cracks, something else begins. You were cast into a role long before you had the chance to write your own lines. But now, maybe for the first time, you can step off the stage. Not to perform a new character, but to finally meet the one who was never given words. The one beneath the borrowed lines. The one who didn't need to be perfect or pleasing or protective. The one who was always there, waiting to be heard. Did you enjoy the content and it made a difference for you? Click on Super Thanks and support our work. Transformation doesn't always look like rebirth. Sometimes it's not loud, not dramatic. Sometimes it's a whisper, the kind that finally dares to tell the truth you've buried for years. You don't need a new story. You need to stop pretending the old one was complete. Healing isn't becoming someone else. It's becoming honest. Maybe the version of you that's still bleeding never got to speak. Maybe every time you said, "I'm fine," a part of you disappeared a little more. Maybe your strength was never strength, just perfected silence. We glorify reinvention. But reinvention can be just another performance if you're still hiding from the parts of yourself that were never allowed to feel. Real change often comes not from doing something new, but from saying something that was never said. I was scared. I needed someone. It hurt more than I let on. These aren't confessions, they're reclamations. Because every time you denied your own truth to stay safe, a fracture formed, and now those fractures are asking to be seen, not fixed. There's a kind of dignity in finally naming what was never acknowledged, the abandonment, the shame. The moments you kept breathing, when all you wanted was for the noise inside to stop. Narrative therapy speaks of integration, not erasure. You don't need to rewrite your past. You just need to let the unsaid become language. Because the unsaid is where the soul starts to rot. And the moment it finds voice, even a trembling one, something shifts. You realize you're not looking for a new life. You're looking for the version of yourself that was silenced too early. And when that version speaks, not with anger, not with blame, but with clarity, the old story begins to dissolve. Not because you escaped it, but because you finally told it truthfully. There's a fear that lives just beneath the surface of change. Not the fear of failure, the fear of becoming someone different and still feeling the same emptiness. You've lived inside your story for so long, even the pain feels like a spine. It holds you upright. You fear that without it, you'll collapse. So you keep rehearsing it, not because it fits, but because it's what you know how to carry. And this is where most people freeze, at the threshold between the familiar wound and the unknown self. Letting go feels like betrayal. Betrayal of who you've been. Betrayal of the voice that kept you safe when no one else did, even if that safety cost you your freedom. But there's a truth hidden in the quiet. You don't need to destroy yourself to start again. You just need to stop repeating the role that keeps you small. Jung called it individuation, becoming whole, not perfect. It doesn't mean abandoning the past. It means no longer being owned by it. The pain happened, but the performance around it, that was learned. And what is learned can be unlearned. The loop isn't in your life, it's in your mind. In the phrases you repeat, in the roles you think you must keep playing to feel real. But what if the door was never locked? What if you memorized the pain so well, you forgot there was ever a handle? There is a version of you that doesn't need to prove anything. Not strength, not survival, not consistency with who you used to be. That version isn't waiting at the end of some great transformation. It's already here, quiet, watching, just waiting for you to stop rehearsing and start remembering who you were before the story began. Not all revolutions begin in fire. Some begin in whispers, in the quiet refusal to keep believing the same old script. You don't need to move cities. You don't need to cut ties, burn bridges, start from zero. You don't need to become unrecognizable to feel reborn. Sometimes all it takes is this. I no longer believe that version. The version where you're always the one who ruins things. The version where your value is measured by how much pain you can endure. The version where you have to suffer to feel worthy of love. You can keep the same name, the same body, the same life, and still change everything. Because the real shift doesn't happen on the outside. It happens in perception, in how you see yourself, in the story you tell when no one else is listening. Existential freedom isn't loud. It's not about doing more. It's about seeing more clearly. It's the silent moment when you stop being loyal to an identity that was never yours. No one will notice it at first. They'll still see the same you, but you'll feel the difference, like air moving through a window you didn't know was sealed shut, like a weight lifting, not because someone took it away, but because you realized you didn't have to carry it anymore. You've already lived enough versions of yourself that were edited for survival. Now it's time for something simpler, more honest, more human. A story that doesn't insult your depth. A life that doesn't demand that you stay silent in your own skin. You don't need a new life. You need a truer one. And sometimes the only revolution required is the courage to whisper, that old version is over. You were never the story. You were always the soul behind it. There comes a point where you stop trying to fix the story and start questioning why you ever believed it in the first place. Carl Jung spoke of the self as something we uncover, not invent. It isn't a mask you craft or a role you perform. It's what remains when all the roles fall away. When the noise dies down, when the narration loses its grip, because you were never the story, not the heartbreak, not the failure, not the endless loop of "I always do this" or "I'll never get out." You were the witness, the breath behind the words, the silence that endured every chapter. To reframe your past is not to deny it, it's to reclaim it, to say, yes, it happened, but it no longer defines me. Viktor Frankl wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." But sometimes the challenge isn't to change, it's to see differently, to recognize that maybe nothing outside has shifted, but you're no longer reading from the same script, and that changes everything. Your pain is not erased, but it's no longer in control. It becomes something sacred, not suffocating. A chapter, not the whole book. So maybe now, without noise, without glory, without anyone noticing but you let go of the story and meet the soul that's been waiting beneath it all along. You are not your wounds. And yes, there is still time to rewrite yourself into something true.